Hello and welcome. My name is Craig Volden. I'm a professor here in the Batten School and also co-director of the Center for Effective Lawmaking. On behalf of Batten and the Center, I'm delighted to welcome today 3 Batten School alumni who have decided to take on public service roles early in their careers. Jack Dematio, Rebecca Hattar, and Megan Porter are joining us today to discuss what it's like to work on the policy staff of members of Congress, as well as the paths that took them from UVA to Capitol Hill, and to answer any questions that our audience members might have along the way. Please go ahead and enter your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom link. I'll be weaving those questions in among some of my own. First, I'd like to welcome all 3 of you and ask you to just give us a brief background on the path that led each of you from the Batten School to work in Congress. Perhaps we can go from Megan to Jack to Rebecca. Welcome again.
Thanks, Professor Bolden. Hey everyone, my name is Megan Porter. I'm a 2017 graduate of UVA. I was a double major in Batten and history. So I came to UVA knowing I wanted to apply to Batten. And so I had kind of talked to some of the admissions team and knew I wanted to have an internship or some sort of experience before I applied in my second year. So I interned the summer after my first year with my then hometown congressman of Dallas, Texas, Pete Sessions, who was chairman of the Rules Committee, which is how Professor Bolden always remembered me from writing memos to the Rules Committee of the House. So I interned, was really, really lucky to find my mentor right then in that first internship when I was 19 years old. He was also a UVA alum and also a Texas native. His name is Kyle Matus. He's great. He's featured very often on UVA Career Center events as well. And he wrote my Batten recommendation letter. We stayed in touch. And then by the time, he was a legislative assistant at my current position at the time when I interned. And by the time I graduated from UVA, he was the chief of staff for Congressman Sessions. So he, I like to joke, bullied me into taking this job. I had only ever interned in DC. I took another internship at the Republican National Committee. So kind of saw the campaign politics, political side. And that was the year of the 2016 convention, which was really interesting to get to be there and experience. So by the time I graduated, I hadn't really applied to that many jobs. I was pretty sure I wanted to work on the Hill, but wasn't positive. And Kyle had a staff assistant position open up on Congressman Sessions' staff. And so I accepted that in September of 2017. And now I'm in my 3rd different iteration of a job, but still on the Hill, still on the House side. And I'm sure we'll address the rest of that journey.
Great.
Yeah, so my name is Jack Dematio. I graduated from Batten in May of 2019 from the MPP program. And in the 2nd year of the program, I applied for a health policy fellowship, the Winston Fellowship, which is available for anyone who's finishing up a graduate program and has an interest in working in health policy in Washington, really in any capacity. It could be in the executive branch, the legislative branch, even outside of government. But it was through that fellowship that I was able to do a placement with Congresswoman Underwood, who represents the district in Northern Illinois, right next to the one that I'm from. My county's actually split between her and my member of Congress. So had admired her work from afar as she was first running in the 2018 cycle, joined her office about 6 months into her first term as a legislative fellow, primarily at that time covering really just health policy issues. And then when my fellowship ended in the summer of 2020, I stayed on as a legislative assistant, still working on health as well as a few other issues. And like Megan mentioned, I'm sure we'll get to those specifics as we move on. But thanks for the invitation, Professor Bolden, to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Great.
Thanks, Jack. My name is Rebecca Hatter. So I did undergrad at the University of Virginia and then stayed on for grad school. In undergrad, I worked on my thesis with Professor Bill Shobe, who is a professor in the Batten School at the time, was not in the Batten School, but wrote my thesis with a policy focus specifically on energy and climate policy, and kind of sat down with him toward the end of my 4th year and said, I'm really interested in this. I'd like to pursue a career in policy. I don't know exactly where, but working with you on this thesis has really made me realize this is my passion. And he then kind of pointed me to the master's program at the Batten School and said, I think you'd be a good fit for this program, and ended up applying, I think maybe March of that year. And I think maybe 1 or 2 months before the application deadline. So it was really cutting it close, but in retrospect, really glad I ended up in the Batten School. It gave me a couple of years to really bounce around and explore my policy interests more, and also, intern all these different places around Washington, D.C., focused on federal policy. So really coming up on my last semester at the Batten School, I, had developed a solid amount of federal energy policy experience. I knew that still, yes, I wanted to pursue energy and climate policy professionally, but I had not yet worked in Congress. I had interned in a lobbying firm specializing in energy policy at an energy trade association, in the Congressional Relations Office within the Environmental Protection Agency, and in the Federal Relations Division of a wind developer. But, at each of these places, my work focused on Congress, but, I just hadn't really gotten my chance with Congress yet. I knew exactly what they were up to, but, hadn't gotten my first chance there. And that's not to say I didn't want to work in Congress. I'd applied to internships on the Hill before, and, never landed anything that first time around. But that really didn't discourage me. It made me even more interested in Congress. It's kind of, you want what you can't have. And so I just kept kind of furthering my experiences off the Hill, and ultimately, convinced someone to give me my first internship on the Hill. So that's just one tip I'll give you all is just because it doesn't work out the first time around doesn't mean you should stop trying. Honestly, in my experience, it wasn't embarrassing to apply that second time around. My experience, employers actually respected it more. So I would encourage anyone who, hasn't gotten their first chance yet to just keep working at it. And if you work hard enough, it should work out. So my first internship on the Hill was with former Congressman Denver Riggleman, who actually represented Charlottesville up until this Congress. Loved the internship. And in my last week, I asked for a meeting with the chief of staff to kind of pick his brain on what my next steps should be. So I sat down and I said, hey, I love my time here. I'd like to work on the Hill after I graduate. Do you have any advice for me? And he said, I know this sounds insane because you'll be graduating with the master's, but you should apply for summer internships. And I looked at him and, it did seem insane to have a master's degree and be competing with freshmen in college for summer internships. But, he said, you'll make more connections that way. You'll get more experience, and also you'll be right on the ground. So if any job openings, present themselves, you'll be right there to snatch them up. So I applied to internships, ended up with the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House of Representatives, and spent my summer looking for a full-time position while interning. And after a couple months, sure enough, someone gave me that first full-time chance, and started out as a legislative correspondent in my current office. Since taken on the legislative assistant role, and I handle energy, environment, climate, natural resources, and a few other related issues.
Wonderful. Thanks for that. And we're going to kind of open it up. I see some questions coming in Q&A, so keep those coming. And I'll ask the first one. So you're each working for relatively junior members of Congress at present. Do you see a different role that staff play for those who are still learning kind of the ins and outs of the job than if you were working for more senior lawmakers?
I'm happy to start. So I'm working for a freshman congressman, Ronnie Jackson. He was just elected in November, sworn in on January 3rd, and I started with him on January 3rd. And my first job, as I mentioned, was with Pete Sessions, who was the chairman of the committee, had been in Congress all but 2 years of my life and had been my representative all but 2 years of my life. So he was in for 22 years, lost in the 2018 midterms, and is now actually back in a different seat. So yes, I can absolutely, having worked for both a freshman and a 11-term congressman, can say there is definitely a difference. I think it's fun, it's exciting. It's part of the reason, I kind of pitched myself for my current job. I knew that I understood the House, and in my second job was in a leadership role. And so I kind of, that's how I pitched myself for my legislative assistant role currently. It definitely is different. It's a little bit more of coaching and training, but you know, it's my boss has so much experience and so much knowledge from 25 years in the military and 10 years at the White House, but doesn't know, you know, House procedure. So there are times when, you know, he's running to the floor and he's like, wait, what's a motion to recommit again? You know, what is this procedural thing that I'm voting on? But, you know, that's kind of fun. And my legislative director is a lawyer and went to law school and is a Hill veteran. So I think that will speak to a later question of an experienced staffer.
Right.
But both my chief of staff and legislative director, this is the second freshman that they're working for, which I honestly don't know that I'll recommend working for a freshman, but it has been fun so far and definitely is a learning experience for both of us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think Megan has a unique perspective since she's worked for both. I've only worked for Congresswoman Underwood, but have been with her now for most of her first term and into her second term. And I'd say, you know, one like concrete difference is, you know, going from a change from a Republican administration to a Democratic administration. And so you think about like committee hearings, you know, those look different for us in the previous Congress to this Congress. And so, you know, thinking about how, you know, Congressman Sessions, for example, obviously has gone through a number of transitions from you know, Republican to Democratic administration and back and forth. But, you know, we're still learning the differences of, you know, what hearings look like in a different type of administration. But even just the course of one Congress to the next, you start to feel more comfortable with things. And, you know, most issues that are coming up now, the Congresswoman has at least some voting record on and some basis that we can look back on as she's considering how to vote on a particular issue or how she's thinking about something that's happening. So I can imagine that if we're already starting to gain more familiarity just in the second term, that, you know, if you're Congressman Sessions and you're 22 years in, you know, everything that's coming up, you've probably seen in some iteration in the past, and it, you know, is helpful, particularly for staff as you're thinking about recommendations to make to your boss about an issue that might come up, whether it's on the floor or in a committee. So hopefully there are many terms ahead of Congresswoman Underwood to gain that experience.
Yeah, so we're getting a little sense of what your job entails. You're all in legislative assistant positions at present. Wondering if you could tell me, you know, what does that mean from the moment you get up to the moment you go to bed? Is it, you know, all along those lines? But also, what are some of the other staff positions that are available with members of Congress, and what, you know, might draw someone, a student or others, to think about, do I want to be an LA? Do I want to be serving some other role? How do y'all think about that? Maybe Rebecca?
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one. So being a legislative assistant is awesome, especially on the House side. You know, people joke 24-year-olds are running the country, and they're a little bit wrong, but they're not completely wrong. You know, I do feel as if, you know, I play a role in my office that's important. As a legislative assistant, I mentioned I have specific issue areas: energy, environment, climate, etc. Each time there's a vote on a bill, the congressman has me as a resource as he makes that voting decision. So any questions he has, even the most specific of questions, I'm responsible for having an answer and fully informing him with the best resources he has. So it's really cool to get to play a role in the process. Sometimes he says, hey, you know what, Rebecca, I'm absolutely not voting that way. This is why. But it's really cool to have an opinion and to have that opinion heard. Aside from, I guess, providing vote recommendations, part of your job as legislative assistant is to bill and you know, any agency action the congressman have questions about or be interested in. You get the opportunity to work with relevant committees in the House of Representatives to convert policy ideas into legislation, and communicate legislative priorities with the House Appropriations Committee. So throughout the year, it's a process of speaking with constituents, speaking with stakeholders, and really refining the congressman's goals and making sure those goals are communicated concretely with the committee that puts together funding for the government every year.
And I can take the other half of the question. So the general office is there's a ladder, I would say. Staff assistant, legislative correspondent, legislative assistant, legislative director. And then on the press side, it's either a press assistant or a press secretary, communications director, and then the chief of staff is at the top. And then there's also a district team, which none of us can really speak to. I interned in a district office, but that's all. And they're the ones like on the ground doing the field work and the casework and more of the constituent interaction. So I would say that usually my first piece of advice to someone who's interning is to make sure you've kind of solidified whether you want press or so legislative, we just call it ledge. And I think that people generally kind of know the way they choose. They usually have more of an interest in kind of the digital, social media, or you have kind of more of the policy focus. But that's not to say, that you can't do both or you can't switch between both. And our communication staff is involved on the policy because they're the ones having to put it in a press release or put it in talkers for a TV hit or whatever it is. So we have a staff of 7, and I would say I probably spend half my day just talking with our staff to make sure we're all on the same page, that the office is running smoothly. And then I guess one other side is kind of the administrative operations side. So usually that's with a scheduler. Sometimes those are the operations director. And then there's also committee staff and leadership staff.
Great. A little more about what does it mean to be a personal staff to a member of Congress versus a committee staff. I think those are somewhat different roles within the policymaking space.
Rebecca, you want to take that? Oh, sorry, Go ahead, Jack.
No, I was going to defer to Rebecca too. She's, I think, the only one of us.
Okay, guys, thank you. So yeah, I guess while I never worked full-time for a committee, I did spend a few months interning with the House Energy and Commerce Committee, as I mentioned. Committee was awesome because you really get to explore your policy interests. You don't interact with constituents much, which, while important, I think in personal offices, it is your primary focus, is engaging with constituents, ensuring that they feel heard, and ensuring that they're informed on the congressman's stances and votes on legislation. So on committee, given my background in energy policy and having studied it through grad school, it was awesome to get to work with the most brilliant minds on those issues. The staff is very small, especially minority versus majority. I think in the House, it's about a 30%, 70% funding split, which is reflected in staff size. And yeah, you just get to dive deep on policy memos, spend all day working on one issue. I think the way it's described is you're a mile deep, but only an inch wide, whereas in personal offices, you're an inch deep and a mile wide. So I don't know if that kind of helps folks understand the difference there, but committee spots are more competitive, in part because you really do get to deep dive in the issue areas that you love the most.
So how would one get a committee staff spot if they were drawn in that direction?
Yeah, so the best advice I would give to those interested in committee is you got to start somewhere. I would, in a heartbeat, Hill internships, no matter which kind you're looking at, are very competitive. So to have the opportunity to intern in a personal office is huge. And that's how, you'll make those connections to get yourself to committee. So we have an intern right now that's doing an outstanding job. She's a master's student at American University and very passionate about cybersecurity. So we, put her in touch with ranking member Caucus Homeland Security staff. And, that was really exciting for her to get to, touch base with them. And now she'll probably be applying for a spring internship. So I think, starting out in a personal office, even if right off the bat, you don't get to explore like those really, policy wonk passions and urges that you might have, you will still get exposure to policy in a personal office that you can then use to position yourself for those committee internships. So that's the best advice I would give.
Great, thanks. In the Q&A, a lot of people are interested in, how do I get my foot in the door? Generally, as well as kind of Batten class of 2022 graduates, how to think about these options and networking possibilities and so on. How much is it thinking about, your hometown member versus those who are really active in issue areas that you care a lot about? Or, how should students be thinking about this at present?
I think those are the two best ways. Those are the two ways I recommend the most. I would say we have a great UVA network here. We have, in non-COVID times, we have a Who's on the Hill happy hour every other month. And there's people in, there's probably 30 or so people that regularly attend. And so if you have a specific issue area or state or, whatever it is, we can find someone to connect you. And I think I'll go ahead and speak for Rebecca and Jack and say that we're happy to help with those connections. I would definitely start with your hometown, or if the hometown is not the party that you want to affiliate with, then look for a neighboring district or someone else in the state. I think that a lot of congressmen have a policy to not deny internships to those who are constituents, which can definitely play in your favor. And then definitely look at the committees of jurisdiction that you're interested in, and then kind of go through and do it based on interest or state. All the committee websites should have that pretty well laid out. And if that will really show something too, if you're able to send an email and say, hey, I'm really interested in health, and I know that you're the ranking member of the health subcommittee of Ways and Means, that just like really shows that you actually know something and are paying attention, and definitely gives you a leg up than any other like cold email, which I would definitely say cold emails are totally fine. One other way to kind of make you stand apart is if you send it during recess, which I can either send you all the House calendar, or it's on like the majority leader's website. And if you're able to say like, hey, hope you're having a good recess, that just kind of really shows that you're aware. And also that's really our kind of our downtime. I wouldn't say we ever have a full downtime, but we, can work like 12-hour days when we're in session. So that just means like the boss is in town and there's votes going on, and there's a lot of committee activity, and I'm just like away from my desk so much more. So I just kind of lose a handle on my inbox, versus recess is kind of like our catch up networking, even internally networking. So that's a really good way to try to get a good time to try to get your foot in the door, I should say.
It sounds like the try again philosophy works out well. Would you advise, if that doesn't work out, try to get any policy related job in DC and then connect from there?
Yeah, I would say that's the best thing you can do for yourself, is if you can't get on the Hill first time around, work somewhere where they know people on the Hill. There's all different sorts of ways. When I started off, I didn't know anyone in Congress. I had zero connections at all. And you do have that ability to foster those connections yourself, and really communicate to Hill staff that you are passionate, you really want to be there. I would say, cold emailing is great. Eventually, you'll make genuine friends that will refer you to their friends. And from there, I had an Excel document of all the different people I ended up meeting with, because it should get out of hand before you get your first job on the Hill. You should feel like, I think I got something like 100 coffees with folks before I had my first full-time job. So again, it's not easy. It's going to feel like a full-time job just to get that internship. But if you really want it, I really do think you'll get there. I haven't heard of anyone who really wanted it and didn't ultimately get there. You might, intern somewhere else a few terms and then ultimately get that full-time job on the Hill or get that first internship. But if you work at it, you know, people will see that passion in you and they'll want to give you your first chance.
Great. It sounded like, Jack, you had a comment on that one too.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, one other thing to keep in mind, I guess I'm biased from my own experiences, but, you know, I totally agree with Professor Bolden's point about just kind of try again, throwing a lot at the wall and seeing if anything sticks. But fellowships are probably like an underappreciated pathway onto the Hill, something that I wasn't really aware of prior to some great conversations with Steve Hiss and Hannah Rose and those of the career team at Batten going into my second year and starting to learn about these. They're a pretty broad range. So I mentioned I did a health policy fellowship. I think there are others that focus on other particular issues, others that are associated with particular parties or I know like the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation has a program, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus has has a program. So, you know, identifying whether there could be some potential fellowships is another pathway in addition to also, you know, applying for internships and staff assistant positions. But yeah, I think, you know, as you probably heard now a number of times, just trying a bunch of different options is probably your best bet.
Great. Thanks for that. Pulling a little bit back to my research, which I enjoy talking about as well. So at the Center for Effective Lawmaking, our research has been suggesting that members of Congress who rely on more senior, experienced legislative staff seem to be better able to move their legislation through the lawmaking process to become more effective lawmakers. This leads me to two questions for you all. First, what's the learning curve like for you as members of that legislative staff in various roles, learning about policy and procedure and connections and all of that? And then the second question is, given so much turnover among legislative staff on Congress, what makes staff members want to stay and why do so many leave Capitol Hill so quickly?
I can take this one. So the learning curve is steep. It's very steep. I can tell you that. I'm still learning every day, brand new, ways of voting on things or, motions to recommit. Megan mentioned, that's something you have to get used to. There's all these different types of motions and procedural steps that, sometimes that's the first day that you've ever seen something like that. A lot of it you can only learn by doing. So honestly, you see it once and then you know what it is for the rest of your life. Other things you can learn by talking to staffers who have 10, 20 years of experience and have seen it all themselves. I think staffers like staying because it's really cool to be in the action. Congress is one of the most powerful institutions in the world. I have cousins in Israel that, my mom showed them a photo of the Capitol building and they knew exactly what it was. The first Congress was hundreds of years ago, and it's awesome every day to feel like your history in the making, that, maybe something that you advised your member on will end up in a history book. I think on the flip side, staffers might want to leave when they realize pay isn't sustainable to raise a family, perhaps, or I think the politics really get to people too. As someone who did come to the Hill because of my love for policy, I think it's frustrating at times to see how deeply entrenched politics are in the policymaking process. A lot of the time, you'll see bad policy gain momentum just because it's politically beneficial, and you'll see good policy killed because it's not. And that's something that deeply upsets me. I wish we could have a policy process absent politics, but that is not the world that we live in. But yeah, I think people just kind of get discouraged over time, seeing good bills, just die, and they get frustrated with folks disagreeing for the sake of disagreeing, and they just need a breather. So yeah, that's what I'll say about the drawbacks.
Megan?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Definitely, I think member retention has something to do with that too. A girl that's been really, really helpful to me in my current job just left the Hill last month because her boss is retiring because he hit his term limit as the ranking member of Ways and Means. So he announced his retirement early, and she kind of felt like, you know, she could stay, she could find another job, but ultimately decided to leave. And I mean, I haven't asked her specifics, but I would imagine her pay at least doubled, if not more, going to downtown to a lobbying shop. So I think especially as we get older, you know, I don't really have to make those considerations yet at 26, but you know, if I want to be in DC and eventually want to afford a house or have children, you know, that's really going to change things, and definitely could not afford anything right now at my current salary.
Right.
But I think in terms of the learning curve, yeah, experienced staff is all the difference. In my previous job, I was member services assistant for the Republican conference under Liz Cheney, and we helped chiefs of staff and members and really all of the staff that was interested in kind of just like shaping an office. And we help a lot with like freshman orientation. So that's the biggest thing that we preach was, you know, yeah, you can hire your best friend who helped you on the campaign, but you're going to be much better served by having a legislative director or legislative staff that has experience. A lot of freshmen come with kind of a list of priorities or goals or topics they want to hit, but it's up to the staff to really, you know, figure out how that actually looks on paper.
Yep. From our Q&A list, from our audience members, keep them coming in. What policy work did you want to do upon graduating, and what work do you do now? I think you've each touched on that a little bit, but how much do you have to be flexible, or do you really need to pursue your passion and get deep into it? How would we think about, again, the breadth versus depth issue there?
Well, first off, I hope it seemed like there was kind of a metaphor. The lights went off as Rebecca was talking about the partisan climate here, but
and there we are.
Yeah, I you know, for myself, like I mentioned, I applied for a health policy fellowship, and then you know my first opportunities in the office working on health policy, which is really what I wanted to do. But you know, all three of us are on the House side, and I think this has kind of been alluded to, but particularly in the House. Because staff, you know, the staff is so small, particularly compared to a senator, it would really be impossible, if you're in a personal office at least, to just work on like one really specific thing. Kind of going back to your previous question about working for a committee, you might be able to zero in a little bit more. But, you know, for example, in addition to health, I also cover Congresswoman Underwood's work on the Veterans Affairs Committee. You know, she's a committee member. She's on the health subcommittee, so a lot of the work that she does overlaps with veterans' mental health and suicide prevention. But then I also cover foreign affairs and social security issues, which, you know, I didn't have like any professional or even significant academic background in prior to getting here. And I think that's probably the case for everyone, that if you're on a legislative team, you're going to be covering issues that go beyond what you had initially intended to do. But I will say, like for myself, you know, while the learning curve has been steep, you also, you know, it's interesting. And like with the foreign affairs portfolio, you know, with, for example, Afghanistan in August, that ended up being like the bulk of the work I was doing, even though health has always been my main issue. So I think you do kind of inevitably end up needing to have some breadth of background, and you know, no matter what you study in your academic work, things will come up that you haven't seen. I mean, I think COVID is probably a great example of that. I guess you could have studied public health or, you know, pandemic preparedness generally, but there are aspects of COVID that we haven't seen in a century and really ever. So there's definitely learning every day that goes on, and part of that includes learning new issues that might be added to your portfolio.
Rebecca and Megan, anything further on that? Generalization versus specialization?
Yeah, I would say you definitely should go into it with flexibility on, you know, the policy areas you'd be willing to cover, especially the popular policy areas. They're gonna, you know, defer to upper level staff first on whether they'd like to cover those issues before offering them to lower level staff. So that's something you'll be competing with. I think also, though, don't be afraid to kind of pitch your qualifications to handle certain issues, especially if you're, you know, graduating from Batten with a master's degree and you did your capstone on something really specific. in a really specific policy area that, you could use to speak to, your expertise on the issue. I know specifically for me, that's something I did when they were deciding my policy portfolio. I sort of went to them with my background and expressed strong interest in energy and climate issues, given, my previous internships. And I did my capstone with a wind developer. And I think I'm the most qualified and the person in this office to handle these issues. No one else in my office had strong attachments to those issues. So, I feel really lucky that I have those issues now. But I also do genuinely believe that, I bring value to the staff because of that background. I think that's what I'd say is, be willing to take on other things, but also advocate for yourself if you feel really qualified for certain issue areas.
Great, absolutely.
Go ahead. I don't have anything new to add.
Yeah, that's great. So I was going to go to, more of those connections. Was there anything looking back in terms of the Batten curriculum or UVA more generally that you found particularly helpful as you started your careers with Congress after graduation?
I would say the writing skills is the biggest thing that I see, because I think that the variety of writing assignments at Batten was really valuable, because pretty much every day I have to write, at least one-page memo. It's like a couple of paragraphs, because that's how we do decisions on whether to co-sponsor a bill or co-sign a letter, is we write a little one-pager for the boss. But then when it comes to his testimony for the Foreign Affairs Committee, I'm writing, 4 or 5 pages of content. So I think having those skills is really valuable. And then just the group setting I kind of touched on earlier, but this is a very, very collaborative environment, and just kind of knowing how to accomplish any of those projects that we had to do in civic leadership or institutions or whichever it was, definitely were really valuable, just the soft skills.
So those decision memos, how tight are they in your office? Are they a paragraph, a page?
So we have a background section that's usually a paragraph or 2, and then a section on what the bill actually does. And so depending on the topic, that what the bill actually does is either about 2 sentences or about 2 paragraphs. Kind of depends on if it's hey, we're offering support to Afghan SIVs, special immigrant visa holders, or if it's a really complex healthcare CMS decision. Mm-hmm. So I would say they never really go over 2 pages, but it's really just kind of those 2 bulk paragraphs, and then maybe a little extension depending on the complexity.
Great, thanks.
I can send it you want if you want it. Probably pretty similar to the memo.
The students would love to see more and more examples. So yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I would just totally agree with Megan. I mean, I did political science and econ as my undergraduate majors, and there you're writing extraordinarily long papers. You'll never turn something 25 pages in to your boss to read, and so recognizing that you need to take in a lot of information and synthesize it so that your boss has everything they need to know, but nothing beyond what they need to know is really important. And one thing I think that's specific to the MPP program, but the 48-hour project that we did for Professor Player was extraordinarily helpful, because so often, that is a timeline that you're dealing with here, or even a lot less than that. And as things come together, being able to, understand what it is that, again, your boss needs to know within a really wide range of information, and synthesize that into something coherent is really valuable, and something that I had no experience doing before Batten, and I had never done a Hill internship or anything. And so I found myself really leaning on the Batten skill set throughout my work, and continue to do it even now.
Yeah, I could imagine a 48-minute turnaround for something you're familiar with, but what was the shortest turnaround for something where you had absolutely no idea and you needed to come forward with a recommendation? Yeah,
that's a good question. I think sometimes it will be, a question of the White House wants to schedule a meeting with your boss on an hour's notice, and you have to put together a memo for it. Which, usually the issue is something that she's really familiar with, but, making sure that she feels adequately prepared is really important. And then, there's something that's come up that's kind of a technical term, like these motions to recommit, which have evolved a little bit, but these are like a procedural step that are used regardless of who's in the majority, but can essentially, right before you vote on final passage of a bill, the minority can offer like kind of a procedural vote on a tangential issue or like a related issue, but sometimes they can be kind of tricky. Congresswoman Underwood, for example, is in a district that, she won her race by 1 point. So we take a lot of difficult votes. And those motions to recommit can come up on like, 10-minute notice before a vote is called. Again, topically, they can range on any issue. So for me, if it's related to foreign affairs or Social Security or veterans or health, I'm trying to read that entire motion to recommit and understand what the issue is before, providing that information to the Congresswoman.
Right. Rebecca, you had something you wanted to add on that?
Sure, I can. I was just going to echo Jack's gratitude for the 48-hour project. And I think I would agree that Batten really taught us to be thorough, and it taught us discipline, that, you should have the ability to sit down and deep dive into a policy issue all day, while being efficient about it. But I think it's important to get to a well-informed policy recommendation. In my office, we always say the best lobbyists are the ones that, will give you both sides of the issue. They'll tell you the concerns they might have with a certain proposal, but they'll also tell you the positive aspects of that proposal as well from different perspectives. So I think it's easy for, perhaps my bosses look at me and say, wow, you really did overkill with the research. You could have just looked at the Republican one-pager and made a decision about that vote in 5 minutes. And the truth is, yeah, I could have. It would have been a lot easier, and it would have saved me a lot of time. But I think Batten really taught us to be experts on the issue. And I do feel I owe it to my boss to have the best available information for him. And so I'm going to read everything before I give him a vote recommendation, as time permits. And I'm going to craft my own one pager for him to read as well.
Great. So more questions from Q&A as they come in, so keep sending those in. I think we've touched on this a little bit in terms of the politics that's involved, politics versus policy. From the outside, Congress looks really partisan, lots of bickering, some might say dysfunction. Is that how you would describe it? Is that an accurate representation? And if so, that hasn't scared you off, so kudos to you. But what keeps you going along those lines, and how much do you work across party lines and all the rest?
I'd say for Congresswoman Underwood, we're really lucky with the committee assignments. She's on Veterans Affairs, which I think is one of the most bipartisan committees in Congress. Sure. We do a lot on a bipartisan basis. The Congresswoman actually just had one of her bills that we've already passed in the House with unanimous bipartisan support, just passed in the Senate last week with unanimous bipartisan support. It addresses maternal mortality among veterans, which thankfully is an issue that everyone is on board with. And I think that because the press naturally is focusing on like these really high level issues on which there is a lot of disagreement, we miss how many of these bills that actually will have really important impacts for people and communities across the country that advance on a bipartisan basis every day. We have a process called suspensions, which would be like generally less controversial bills that in the House you can suspend the rules. So instead of the bill having to go through the entire committee process and a really long floor debate and all these procedural votes, you can essentially suspend the rules, bring the bill right to the floor for a vote, and then the bar is a little higher to pass it. It needs a 2/3 majority instead of a simple majority to pass. But we pass bipartisan bills all the time using the suspension process. And because they're, not as noteworthy as some of like the big issues that get debated, nobody really covers the passage of these suspensions. But every day we're working on a bipartisan basis to get stuff done. And the other thing I'd say is on the staff level, I have lots of great relationships with Republican staffers who I can go to if the congressman has a bill that we're trying to make bipartisan, or just over the course of, Megan referenced Who's on the Hill, or, I belong to the House Staff Fitness Center. Like, these things aren't like divided on party lines. So you end up just interacting with people, regardless of their party affiliation. And, maybe you're just bonding over a shared love of UVA sports, or, just talking about what workout you're doing in the fitness center. But because of that, I don't think that things are so acrimonious from a political perspective that we're unable to get along with each other personally.
Right, I imagine it's less fun to report on things that aren't contentious as the name calling and the rest of it gets on the 24-hour news cycle. Other thoughts, Megan or Rebecca?
Yeah, it's definitely been a tough year. I think, between COVID has contributed to that. It was honestly a really long time until my boss talked to a Democrat in person, just between, the virtual world. And we have an R+33 district. So we, I often don't have to research as much as Rebecca does, because I know the way that my boss is going to believe on, and how our constituents are going to want us to act on certain issues. So that makes my life a little easier some days. But I think, like Jack said, on the personal connections, they're all still there, and people have respect for each other and can work on a bipartisan basis. But obviously, it is a tough world, and the burnout is definitely real. I've even felt it. I hit 4 years in September on the Hill, and I know I used to be a little more energetic, and I've gotten a little disillusioned, but I'm trying to keep up the fight. But it is it's a very social community, so that definitely helps. That at the end of the day, even if I got in a committee fight with a friend, I can send a Teams chat and say nothing personal, just the job.
And that works reasonably well. People aren't holding grudges along those lines.
Oh, not that I know of.
Great. Great. Rebecca?
Yeah, I would also just say that while there are going to be political battles, and yes, the Hill is a partisan place, as a staffer, you have a decision if you're going to worsen the problem or if you're going to work to improve it. So I think, just like Jack and Megan said, that those interactions you do have with the other party, with folks working for members of the other party, are really important. It's important how you conduct yourself. It's important you don't unnecessarily politicize an issue, or judge someone because of how they were raised or what their beliefs are. There's no easy fix to this problem, but I do think that everyone can take little steps to get us to a better place, at least on the staff level, or at least ensure that the issues we have don't worsen.
Great, thanks. We've heard from a lot of members and staff in Congress that both certainly individual people and the institution itself suffered immensely from the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. Are you willing to share anything about your experiences that day, and how have you seen kind of the functioning of Congress and your jobs in particular affected in the aftermath, if at all?
Well, I'll just start by saying I was not in the buildings that day. We were still working remotely for the most part. So not only was I not in that day, but we didn't end up coming back in until people were fully vaccinated, which ended up being months later. So I think there was also a cooling off period in terms of staff being back. So I think my own experiences are radically different than colleagues and members who were in here those days. So I'll defer to Megan and Rebecca. I'm not sure where they were, but I think my understanding of the developments on January 6th were probably the same as any of you. Like, I was just watching the news and seeing what was happening, and so probably a lot different than those who were here that day.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I was here day 3 of the job with my coworkers that I didn't know at all. It was a horrible day. I mean, it's pretty obvious, but it was really scary. We're in Cannon office building, which is the closest one to like the Library of Congress and the Metro stop. So we're right next to the RNC and the closest building to the DNC, which is where the 2 pipe bombs were placed. So we were evacuated at like 1 p.m. and went to my chief of staff's old office in Longworth. So that's kind of when I knew it was getting serious, when we got evacuated. It was at least nice that we had 2 offices in there. So there was a big group and we could, really kind of commiserate together. And, we had like an evacuation plan and all that. But yeah, it was hard. And then I think just the aftermath too of having the National Guard here and having to walk past like 8 machine guns on my way to work and just feeling like I was in like a militarized zone was really uncomfortable. And just, it was hard. And I think the institution, I mean, it's great that we, came in and voted that night and continued processing. I think that was a really important show of strength. But, obviously I think some relationships were probably severed, both staff and member level. My previous job was with Liz Cheney. So that was an interesting kind of aftermath of hearing her speaking out on the issue versus, the political calculations. So yeah, but hard day.
Yeah, I would, echo Jack and Megan. That was a difficult day for all of us. And I was working from home because of COVID, just like Jack. But we all saw the same clips on TV. It was, it was heartbreaking to see staff and lawmakers have their lives threatened while they were just trying to do their jobs. We all share different views and that's totally fine. But I think it's really unacceptable that those differences manifested themselves as violence and destruction of property on that day. I know I had difficulty getting literally anything done on that day. And in the days and weeks following, it was on my mind. And I think we all do have really important voices, but something our country needs to work on is working together and hearing each other and productively disagreeing with each other. So that's what I'll say about January 6th.
Yeah, thanks for sharing your experiences. Part of what we teach at the Batten School is you can, quote, lead from anywhere, right? So how does that play out from where you've been sitting? Do you all consider yourself leaders at this point, or how does that play into your thinking and your roles?
I can take this one again. So my very first day in Congress, I was handed an intern manual with basically just the instructions of how to be an intern. And it said in all caps, "You are not here to make a difference." And that was tough to read because I was still like full energy, like, let's do this thing. And they're like, no, shut it down. But so that, as it turns out, the guidance was in there because a former intern approached the congressman on his first day with a bill idea. And as you might imagine, that did not go over well. I would say in retrospect, though, I think that guidance really sent the wrong overall message. While yes, an intern or a staff assistant or even a legislative correspondent should not approach the congressman with a bill idea without going through the proper channels. I think, every member of a Congress, man or woman, staff is important no matter what your level is. And you can make a difference within that role. I think one important thing that even interns don't really realize is our office would not function without them. And to just excel at the tasks that you're assigned, really, like, it's important because it saves staff above you from doing that task themselves. And I think ultimately it trickles down to legislative staff having more time to work on legislative priorities. And I know even like our staff assistant, I would describe him as a leader because he organized a talk series for our interns, and he had professionals from all over DC come in and talk to these kids all over the New York delegation, once or twice a week. And that was really awesome for the interns because they got to make these great connections. They learned a lot. And I think it really helped them, work toward those professional goals that they have. So I think like the important message is really, you don't have to lead in a big way to lead or be considered a leader. And you should really keep that in mind, that even if you're doing something really small and you don't feel important in the moment, you're making a difference in the legislative staff's lives. So yeah.
So the leadership is not do your boss's job or go along those lines, but it is be entrepreneurial to help, the whole team do better, presumably. Yeah.
Right.
Question specifically for Megan here. You've held a variety of positions, including with Representative Liz Cheney and Representative Pete Sessions. How much did you see the nature of your job changing depending on the boss you had in particular, if you're willing to share? Is it pretty much the same no matter who you work for, or is it important to find just the right fit?
So I'll start off with saying I just have had 3 really different jobs. So I think that has really affected things more than the members. I would say that my current boss, Ronnie Jackson, and Pete Sessions are pretty similar personality-wise, both Texans, both super Southern, gentlemen kind of guys. So that's been pretty consistent, but it absolutely is a personality difference. I think even if I was to be a legislative assistant for a different member, it's probably somewhere between like 60 to 80% the same job, just structurally, but it's really going to change based on the personality and the issues and priorities of the boss. I think there's some members that, they want to read a 80-page Congressional Research Service, CRS is what we call it, that they're our Library of Congress researchers. They're going to want to read that issue, that the whole thing themselves, versus some bosses will just want to, 4-sentence paragraph, bullet points, whatever it is, summary. So it very much does depend, I think, on the member, but I would say, every office generally looks like somewhat the same. It's just kind of the little ebbs and flows of the personality and the preferences of the member.
Great, thanks for sharing that. Jack, a question for you. Part of your portfolio involves assisting Representative Underwood with the Black Maternal Health Caucus. What's involved with that work?
Yeah, so Congresswoman Underwood co-founded the Black Maternal Health Caucus just 3 months into her first term. And for those who are unfamiliar, a caucus is kind of like it's an informal group of members who get together around a particular cause or affinity. So the Democratic Caucus and the Republican Caucus, those are caucuses. There's the Congressional Black Caucus and Hispanic Caucus, and there's also like issue-based caucuses. And so this caucus was founded to address the maternal mortality crisis in the United States and the racial disparities in maternal health outcomes. The United States has the highest pregnancy-related mortality ratio of any high-income country. And for African Americans, the rate is 3 to 4 times higher than white Americans. That's a disparity that cuts across income and education levels. And for Congresswoman Underwood, it's personal. She lost one of her graduate school friends 3 weeks after Dr. Shalon Irving died, giving birth to her first child, Soleil. And so that was Congresswoman Underwood's personal motivation to co-found this caucus. And in terms of what the caucus does, it's pretty broad-reaching. There's a heavy legislative component. So Congresswoman Underwood introduced this legislative package called the Momnibus. There was a set of bills designed to address every clinical and non-clinical driver of the U.S. maternal health crisis, and working to get that legislation advanced. So actually the bill that I referenced earlier that just passed the Senate with unanimous bipartisan support last week is one of the Momnibus bills. So exciting to see this initiative now actually, make progress in the legislative process, but there's other components to it as well. We try to raise public awareness, host events, engage with the administration, starting with the previous administration, now the current administration, and really, both elevating the issue as a priority and then actually advancing legislation to address it. And I actually apologize. I actually have to leave to staff my boss right now, but just want to thank you all so much for hosting me for the conversation, and Professor Volden for moderating, and Megan and Rebecca for being my co-panelists. It was great.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Jack.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
So let me take that idea to Megan and Rebecca. Caucuses generally, but how do you think about kind of the nature of building up a coalition? So you have an idea for a bill. Do you rely on caucuses? Do you rely first on your party members? Do you first look for somebody of the other party to move things forward? How do you work those early stages?
I'm actually introducing my first bill on Friday, so I can kind of speak to the process there. So I would say a lot of the times the original idea either comes from the boss or from the district. So we get a lot of ideas from like our district staff from what they're hearing from constituents, or from, you know, just getting notes and calls and emails from constituents directly, or like, you know, constituents, including, you know, just an average person speaking on their own behalf, or someone speaking on behalf of their company or college or whatever it is. So we have been hearing a lot about the vaccine mandate, and my boss is a doctor. So he really wants to focus on kind of the natural immunity side of COVID that's not being considered. So that's what this bill does. So it started hearing from constituents and a combination of my boss. And then the first email I sent around, so I sent it to legislative counsel, who actually like writes the bills for us. You know, we just send the language and they kind of make it pretty, make sure it's legal, and put it in a specific format. And then I sent that around to the doctors caucus. So another caucus, this is just all GOP members who are doctors or medical professionals before Congress, and kind of got co-sponsors from there. And then have sent it around to a couple constituent groups to get their feedback and make sure it was covering the right basis. And then eventually we'll send it out to all the Republican legislative directors, just kind of to do a last call to get some co-sponsor support. And then from there, I send it to my press team, and they're sending it around right now to try to get, you know, an op-ed or an op-ed placed in a local newspaper, or get on TV potentially to discuss it. And then we'll actually introduce on Friday. Right now we have 2 co-sponsors. Maybe Rebecca will get on it, give me 3. That's the general process.
Some of the buildings sounded they're GOP and Republican. You know, how do you think about the messaging aspect of what your bill is doing versus, was there any way to get it through a Democratic House?
No, we weren't too worried about that. I'd say a freshman in the minority, it's definitely a messaging process, and I'm probably hurting some of your metrics for effective lawmaking. So sorry about that, but that's the nature of the beast right now. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely issues, especially, you know, for foreign affairs or healthcare, that we will very much attempt to start off with, you know, a Democratic partner co-lead, and, you know, kind of start from there to make sure we can. But especially for something like this, you know, we knew it was a messaging bill only.
Sure, but the idea was that the public discussion is taking vaccines as the only solution, and one could think more broadly than that. And so your hope is to get that message as part of the public dialogue?
Yeah, that's correct.
Great. I mean, that feels like an important purpose as well, obviously. Yeah, fantastic.
Hopefully so.
Rebecca, you had something?
Yeah, I would just say that you know, I think it's important to realize that even bills introduced in this Congress by the minority, you know, maybe most likely those will not get voted on this time around. But, you know, you often see new iterations of bills through different Congresses eventually get that vote after being refined over several years and that sort of thing. So I would say that even if a bill is really, you know, just a messaging tool right now, there are plenty of examples where, you know, bills do become law ultimately down the road. I also think that until I started in this job, I didn't exactly realize how long the process of getting from the idea to introducing a bill is. A lot of it at the beginning is just research, but you know, then you're connecting with multiple different committees in the House and getting their insight on your idea, and you might connect with federal agencies to get their you know, sense of a policy need in that area. You're talking to stakeholders and constituents, gathering their thoughts, and then you're running those thoughts back through the same committee channel and agency channels again. So I actually have not gotten to the point where I've, you know, had a bill introduced that I worked on, but there are a lot of small ideas kind of I would say some are in the baby stages, but some are, you know, in the more final stages of kind of getting refined and getting ready for bill introduction. So So it's not like I go to sleep and wake up the next day and introduce a bill. While that does happen, it's usually not done that way.
Right. It's interesting to think through all of the many stages early in the process, right? And so by having a bill out there, more people know, oh, well, you're interested and excited about this issue. And so you build those networks and connections moving forward. I imagine with such junior members, a lot of it is just using bills to start making some of those connections. Is that your experience?
Yeah, that's definitely something to keep in mind is, again, like Megan said, even if this initial bill is really just messaging legislation, you start to realize, my congressman, my boss is very passionate about the Great Lakes and protecting them, which does happen to be a bipartisan issue. So once you identify, all right, well, everyone in the Great Lakes Task Force might be receptive to receiving this email from us about a legislative initiative we're working on related to the Great Lakes. Just kind of having those contacts and having them used to hearing from you. And it is this kind of back and forth where then they'll know to reach out to you about Great Lakes issues as well, because, in the past you've been inclined to support those efforts. So it is something that you kind of learn over time, who are my allies in this space. And you do get more strategic than just reaching out to the entire party on certain bills.
Right.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And there's a lot of times if one member office leads a bill or a letter that I know my boss is going to really agree with or is interested in, I'll reply and, be like, hey, let's work together on this. If you have any other ideas, or, if you want to lead anything together, let's do this, that kind of thing. And same with like lobbyists or, as much as we love to hate them, that's something I've had experience with too. Of, they urge the co-sponsoring of a certain bill, and that's something I can say, oh, my boss is interested in kidney health because his sister is a transplant survivor. Let me know, make sure you keep me updated on the progressions on this issue.
Great. I want to remind our audience to include any last questions in Q&A. We'll be wrapping up in a couple minutes, but if you have any pressing questions, I did want to dive in a little bit into, you do interact with lobbyists, and they certainly get a bad reputation sometimes for those who don't know what they're up to. How do you think about what they're up to? Are they presenting you with just one side of the issue, or a more of a balance? Are they telling you the truth and getting you to the answers you want? How are lobbyists playing their role?
Yeah, I think Rebecca hit on this earlier, but it's usually pretty easy to tell whether or not they're just only, talking about their priority or their client or their own interest. My chief of staff has been on the Hill for 10 years or so, and he has a lot of really good connections. So pretty early on, he kind of gave me a list or put me on emails with probably 10 or 20 and said, this is someone you can trust, kind of thing. So I think because DC is so social and everyone kind of knows, it's a small enough world that you kind of know the ones that are trustworthy or not. So I haven't had any problems so far, and also just kind of approach everyone with a grain of salt until, I'm more of a guilty until proven innocent mindset when it comes to them, for better or for worse.
Okay.
Yeah, I did touch on this earlier. I would say, lobbyists should and can be used as a resource. I think generally it's good to have trust issues towards them until, they prove they're a solid resource to you. Lobbyists do get burned. I would say if they give you bad information and that information gets relayed to your boss and he votes based on that bad information, or in part because of that bad information, that's a big deal. That's something our office is not going to forget. And we might take meetings with that lobbyist down the road. We might not. But we're not going to trust them again after going through something like that. So I would say anyone thinking about lobbying or interacting with lobbyists in the future as a legislative staffer, keep in mind, you know, a good lobbyist should be able to explain the issue to you without you having done any background research at all. And they should give you a pretty broad and as objective as possible view on that issue. That's what I would consider a good lobbyist.
Right. Good. Well, I know you're all very busy up there right now, so I do want to thank you again so much on our behalf for sharing your time and your insights with us. I did want to give you an opportunity if there were some final thoughts that you wanted to share with the students in our audience before you go.
It's a great place to work, and I would say if you're considering it, definitely start as early as possible, because I think it's a lot easier to start on the Hill than to come back later on. And then a fun tidbit, and this is also, you know, to advertise, all our emails on the House side are the same. So mine and Rebecca's emails are both megan.porter@mail.house.gov, and I can put this in the chat, but it's all the same format. So first name dot last name @mail.house.gov. So even if you just know the name of someone, you can pretty easily find out their email. And again, just use this as a network. The connections here are really, really important for better or for worse. So definitely, you know, as much as we can help out, regardless of party or state or issue affiliation, take advantage of your friends of friends.
We really appreciate that.
Yeah, you'd actually be surprised how long it takes some people to realize the format is standard throughout the entire House of Representatives. The Senate side, it's different, so don't try it over there. But yeah, House side, Rebecca.Hatter. I guess final thoughts, I would just say, challenge yourself to establish working relationships with people you might disagree with, and challenge yourself to find that common ground. And then I don't see enough Batten bases on the Hill, so I hope more of you will think about joining us.
Wonderful. Well, thanks to both of you, and thanks to our audience for joining us.